Good morning, basic people. Welcome to the People's Basics. Today is April 27th, and today on the program, we are doing another Commoner's Corner segment. Today, we're going to be talking to Alyssa Bradley, and in addition to what we normally talk about in terms of trying to define what the basic responsibility of government is to its people, we'll also be talking about some of her top issues in regards to social justice, energy sustainability, and how do we properly grassroots organize. So we want to encourage you all, if you want to come onto the program and have these conversations yourself to talk about your own top issues, we highly encourage you to do so by checking out the description section below or checking any of our social media profiles and seeing our Linktree link. Click that and you will find the registration form for you to come on as well. So with that being said, let's bring on to the program Alyssa to come introduce herself to the People's Basics audience. Alyssa, welcome to the People's Basics.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
You're very welcome. And so, Alyssa, before we get into talking about politics and what the issues of the day we need to be addressing, I like to have our audience know who we get to talk to. And so would you mind doing a brief introduction of yourself, of where you're from, what you do, and how you politically identify?
Sure. So I am originally from New Jersey, central New Jersey. It exists. I'm living in Philly. I've been living and working here for the last 3 years. I've been involved in everything in the nonprofit world, from canvassing door to door to grant writing and larger organizing. So my career has been made out of advocacy and policy focused work.
Okay. And how would you define your politics currently?
That's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I guess if I had to pick a phrase, it would be democratic socialist. But that's not necessarily always accurate, right? I think I'm just a millennial who's like, hey, maybe people shouldn't be punished for being poor. And so I don't really know, but I do have some ideas, some very concrete principles of what I think, the role of government should be.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes it is a bit difficult to try and bucket ourselves into these narrow labels. I've certainly been someone who has had my own feelings evolve, and there are some core principles that I think really define me more than just an ideology. And so, Alyssa, I'd love to ask, what are some of those core principles of how you think government should be operating in its, responsibility to its citizens?
Absolutely. So I think for me, the biggest kind of indicator of where government should be involved is this a societal issue? And I know that's broad and vague, right? But when you talk about things like healthcare, thousands and thousands of Americans do not have access to healthcare or to good healthcare, and it's leading to a lot of horrible things like bad pandemic responses, increased obesity, asthma, diabetes, hypertension, all of that kind of stuff, those bad health outcomes that really do have impacts on the country's economy. So for me, that is an indicator. Poverty is also one of those things that isn't, we're dealing with an actual pandemic, but poverty has been a pandemic in the United States for a very long time. So those are kind of my litmus tests. Is this a grand issue that affects everyone? And if it does, then I think it's the government's time to step in.
Okay. And so let me ask you, there's obviously lines between the government stepping in to do something and then the government trying to step in to be the sole individual doing something. And so I'd love to ask, in your perspective, is there any criteria that you see where government should be a provider of something versus the sole provider of something?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't hashed that out yet. I think it all comes on a case by case basis. We have to look at individual policies and the effects that they'll have, and obviously nothing operates in a vacuum, right? So even if government were to take the sole role in addressing something like access to healthcare, then that would have an effect on a lot of other policies and departments and, the way our economy operates. But yeah, no, I don't really know if there's a specific line I can draw there. But I think one of the biggest things that we need to do right now is focus on, providing that basic, as is the point of the show, is to provide basic needs for people. There's these great new green amendments being passed in states' constitutions that state that clean water is a human right and need to be provided by the state. Things like that, I think, are very important moving forward when we talk about, the health and safety of the public.
Yeah. So let me give like a specific use case, because I think this is one
Sure.
of the biggest issues for, the DSA and generally some of the progressive movement. And we were talking about public health before. We got things like Medicare for all, which is a mainstream policy conversation around health insurance. And the big debate in, frankly, the Democratic primary was whether or not you move to something like a single payer model where the government is that sole provider versus we move to like a public option where people buy in. And then you had some people who had like a middle lane where it's like, it's still kind of like Medicare for all, but we're not abolishing competing private insurance. And so I'd like to ask, in your opinion, obviously, I think we can all agree on the idea of establishing basics in society. But I'd love to hear in your mind of like the grassroots organizing and trying to actually move towards those. How do you think we can best like organize on these things? We certainly have some progressives who say like doing a public option at all would be basically deleterious to their Medicare for all movement. Others say that it's a nice incremental step towards getting closer and closer to government being the provider. How do you think tactically we should be approaching making progress towards establishing these basics?
Sure. I think I actually had a great conversation about this with my friends recently. One of the things that I think that we need to focus on grassroots wise is that we need to be mindful of the political capital that we're spending. So in my mind, progressive grassroots organizing should not be spending political capital on those half measures, because eventually we're going to have to come to the table to negotiate. And I don't want us to, from a strategy standpoint, be in a position where we're not even asking at the get-go for what we really want. So in my head, progressive grassroots organizing, which most grassroots organizing is progressive, instead of vying for something like a $15 minimum wage, I think we should be grassroots organizing around a UBI. It's been 10 years that we've been organizing around the fight for 15. It's part of my work and my capacity professionally right now. And I'm not saying we shouldn't pass a $15 minimum wage. I'm just saying I think that if we're really trying to address the root cause of poverty, a UBI would be a better tool. And so for me, it makes more sense for small progressive organizations or even large progressive organizations to spend that political capital wisely and go for broke, man. Go for broke. Like you're going to have to compromise on something, right? No good legislation happens without both parties being dissatisfied. I think that's like a general
Bit,
quote
yeah.
we say in politics, right? So, with that in mind, we might as well start from a strong position. So, yeah.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I would actually ask if you think we should be even embracing, like comparatively, like I have had this conversation with several people in the past between how do activists talk about issues versus how do politicians need to talk about issues. And sometimes the activist crowd can have a little bit more freedom, potentially being a bit more bold in their ask, even asking for more than they think is maybe reasonable to accomplish through it as a form of anchoring. While it might be a little harder for a politician to inherently do that because they need to kind of come off as seeming reasonable to some degree and maybe even moderate to some degree in order to keep themselves getting elected. Do you think that we should be basically telling exactly what we think is like actually realistic and what we can do? Or do you think we should be a little bit more aggressive with our asks so that when we come to the compromise table, it gets kind of negotiated down to closer to where we actually thought it should be? Like, how do you think we should be? Because one approach is like being honest in what we think we can actually do. And the other is like, it's a little manipulative, but it's in the pursuit of getting something a little higher. What do you think is that better approach?
Right. So honestly, I think it's a marriage, right? I think we need to be asking for the aggressive thing. I think we need to be coming to that negotiating table with that very assumptive, aggressive ask. But I don't necessarily think it has to be out of our capacity. Things like Medicare for all, things like UBI, they can be done. And so I don't want to frame it in that way of like, maybe it's unrealistic. Because with the political will, it might be unrealistic, but capacity wise, we could do it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty
point. Yeah.
I think that's kind of, it's fair to say that we can't be framing them as if they're not possible. We should be asking for the things that we think are possible, even if they are bold. And so, I wanted to ask now, kind of turning away from the economic side and more to the other thing that you came on and told us you're interested in, which is environmental sustainability. Obviously, I think they're a little bit related in that you can kind of think about these big picture types of things when you're having your bills afforded to you. But I wanted to ask, in your opinion, what do you think we need to be doing primarily to be making this shift towards a more, sustainable environment?
I think number one, it's the responsibility of our governments to create diversified and sustainable energy grids. There's no reason in my mind why every single governmental building in the United States does not have solar panels on it, except maybe if they're in Seattle, Washington. But there's no reason that shouldn't already exist. And the fact that we are still fighting against fracking infrastructure, even in this administration, still fighting against fracking infrastructure, still fighting with the oil and gas industry for dominance over, just favorability in politics. Like, it's ridiculous to me. I think that we're 10 years too late to start really creating an energy grid that will be sustainable and will mitigate the worst realities of climate change or the worst effects of climate change. But, it's the U.S. military says it's the number one security threat to the United States, and yet our government has done nothing, or next to nothing, in my mind. Some states are doing a great job. New Jersey wants to put a wind farm off the coast to power the state, which awesome, and yet that is met with resistance because people are, I don't want to look at windmills, they're ugly, and like, what? So I just get very frustrated by it because I really feel like our government has failed us in diversifying our energy consumption. And I don't know what else there is to say. I think, our government has to set the tone. Private companies can do all they want. They can have all the charging ports in their parking lots for electric cars. They can say they're using only green energy from their energy provider. But the fact of the matter is that energy provider is getting dirty, like rife with fossil fuel energy.
And so let me ask you this. In terms of making this transition, you've talked about setting a tone, but what does that specifically look like? Is that a ban on certain energy production? Is that a carbon tax? What do you think is that form of doing a transition? Because I think you could even agree to, like, we can't just simply turn it all off all at once. We have to build up the new supplies that would replace it. And so there's going to be a transition period, and all the people who are already working in the fossil fuel industry also have to be kind of put through the transition. And so I'd ask, how do you see that role of government coming in? Is it heavy-handed bans? Is it incentivization of the private market? What is your philosophy in how government gets itself involved?
Yeah, I think it's both. There has to be a little bit of both. I understand, that we can't just say, "Oh, no more coal," right? That would completely devastate places like West Virginia and the entire Appalachian region, right? I mean, you can make the case they're already devastated, but
Yeah.
it would be horrible, and I understand that. We can't do things like that, but what we can do is say, "Hey, we need to start transitioning the easiest things that can be transitioned," right? So things like, how do I put this? So at ports, specifically the port in Newark, New Jersey, right? That's the one I'm most familiar with. They have created basically this, like, it looks like one of those hairdryer bonnet things that goes over the smokestack of a ship in order to trap all of the emissions, because ships just can't turn off when they come into port.
Mhm.
That's awesome, but that's not exactly the kind of stuff I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is there's also thousands and thousands and thousands of trucks that come through that port every single year. And most of those trucks are extremely old. And the amount of particulate matter that they're emitting is insane and has led to insane rates of childhood asthma in Newark. So things like providing contracted truck drivers with money to upgrade the engines in their trucks to post 1998, which cuts down on about 80% of those emissions. Things like incentivizing the buying of electric cars. Things like, I don't know, maybe not building any new infrastructure like liquid natural gas ports, and not encouraging the continued expansion of fracking in the United States. There's both. You have to build up the new as you're tearing down the old. That's what has to happen. But the way we phrase that, I think, as organizers is, you've let us down for so long. It's time to do something. We're not going to accept stagnation. And I think from a social justice perspective, there are things that I wouldn't want to see, like a carbon tax only affects communities, only really makes it so that communities who are already dealing with a ton of pollution will deal with more pollution, because the highest polluting facilities will then receive credits to pollute more, whereas newer facilities can do retrofitting to make them to cut down on their emissions. So from a social justice perspective, I don't know if a carbon tax is the best way to go, but there are certain things that we can do. And I think the biggest one for me is not building any new oil and gas infrastructure. That should be a no-brainer.
Okay. So, I mean, some of the things that I'd be curious about in terms of how we actually accomplish that is, one of the things that I think is often slightly mistaken within the progressive movement is that even if we don't use some of these fossil fuels as energy sources, they are actually still things that, create a lot of other products in consumer products. Petroleum, coal, all these things are still used. And so I think sometimes we have to be kind of like careful in that we're not trying to destroy the industry. We're trying to get people off it as an energy source. We don't want the combustion. And so I think we do need to talk about kind of more so the building up and the, transitioning of the energy rather than attacking particularly the industry itself, I guess, because there are going to be still people who work in it. And I don't think that we should be inherently demonizing the idea of we use petroleum, we use natural gas, but we can't keep burning these things. It's just fundamentally causing damage to our communities. And I guess I would do also just a minor amount of pushback on the notion of carbon taxes, because I would say that, as you said before, the older facilities are going to be higher emitters. Those are going to generally be in poor areas that couldn't have made the investment. But that means that you have the corporation in that area that is being that emitter, basically emitting that externality out to the public and not having to pay any cost of the pollution that they're doing to their community. That carbon tax could then be reinvested into the community so that they could actually improve their health, or as popularized by hundreds of economists who have endorsed a carbon tax and dividend, you could just simply return it back to them in the form of a basic income, so that maybe if they don't want to stay in that area, they could also move if they're so inclined. But I think that there is a notion of a carbon tax being the basic pricing in of the externalities that corporations are currently just putting out to the public while they internalize the profit. So I'm curious how you feel on that point.
I think that historically we've done a really bad job of holding companies accountable for environmental destruction. And so I don't know if I would trust that. I think communities have been devastated for a long time. We know environmental racism exists. It's not new. We've been talking about it since I've been in college, which is like, I've been talking about it for 10 years. And we've not seen any real mention of it until, this administration's environmental plan did mention environmental racism, which was great. But until then, I hadn't seen anything, even from the state of New Jersey, who, every single environmental organization in that state, because when I was working in that space, Greenpeace, the Conservation League, the organization I was working for, Clean Water Action, are very vocal about that. And still, the city of Newark, even with an awesome mayor like Cory Booker, who is now New Jersey's senator, did nothing about it, or could do nothing about it. And so I don't know. I understand, and I think probably practically a carbon tax would be the best thing that we could do immediately to mitigate some emissions. I'm just cautious about it because we have such a horrible history of really being able to hold companies accountable for what they're doing to the environment.
I think it's fair to say that we need to be doing more than a carbon tax to make sure that these are accountable. But I am a big fan of that, because I do think that it is the incentivization to really say, right now these things are extra cheap, and that's why we do it, because they're putting out all the extra cost to the public to have to deal with it. And so this at least says, hey, we're pricing in the real cost of actually using fossil fuels. So, Alyssa, we've gotten to talk about a lot of things, especially around public health. Do you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share with our audience today? Or, as we always love to offer our guests, do you have anything that you want to ask back to me as we're wrapping up today's episode?
I actually have a question for you. How are you feeling about the New York mayoral race?
Oh, okay.
Because I'm in Philly, I don't get any news about that except for Twitter. So I want to know what you're hearing.
So, from the area, I would say that it is generally going down the home stretch. We're feeling in a relatively good space.
Awesome.
For those who don't know, we've done this in several other videos, but we as an organization are backing Andrew Yang as the candidate for New York City's mayor race. Currently, in terms of polling, he's been consistently up by roughly 10%. So we feel pretty good there, but we don't want to rest on our laurels. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're now just starting to see all the candidates hit the airwaves with their TV ads, some better than others. I just saw Scott Stringer's ad today, and it was so bad. Oh God, I was very thankful, because it's like he was actually gaining some momentum in the race. And so I would say for people out there who want kind of the quick form summary, we have 3 candidates right now who are actually serious contenders. It's Andrew Yang, it's Eric Adams, and it's Scott Stringer. Then you have a second tier of people who could potentially win, but they're more in that kind of class of dark horse, where you have Maya Wiley, Raymond McGuire, and then arguably Diane Morales, who's kind of building some momentum. And then you have a third tier where it's they're probably not going to win, but they're going to be there for the whole race. You got people like Sean Donovan, Catherine Garcia. I think, is that it? And then you got people who are Paperboy Prince, who we love, but he's not going to win. So I feel good right now. I think that we are in a good position, but the debates are starting, I think, this week. and the TV ads are starting. So we'll have to report back in a couple weeks to see how polling data shakes out. But right now, I'm feeling good. And on the ground, most people basically only really know Andrew Yang. When you ask most people, it's like that or like no one, frankly. So that's the thing. The one thing that concerns me is a lot of these mayoral elections are decided by a very small percentage of New York City. And so I feel like Yang does better with kind of like the broader audience, but those tend to be sometimes the people who just don't show up to vote. So that's like my biggest concern is we'll have to see how the TV ads play out on the polling, and we have to see how the GOTV efforts go of get out the vote. But yeah, I'm feeling good about the New York City race.
Awesome. It's good to hear.
Yeah. So, Alyssa, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the program today. How can people check you out if they want to go hear more of your thoughts going forward?
Sure. I mean, I try to stay active on Twitter. And now I don't even know my handle off the top of my head. So, that's how I try. But I do a lot of it for my job. So it becomes, I don't necessarily want to do it all the time for work, for personal. Oh my goodness. All right, I will get that to you, and maybe you can put it up on the screen.
Yeah, we got.
While we're
I have it from your sign up. You have it as A Bradley
great.
R3.
Thank you.
So yeah,
Okay.
if that's how you want people to go check you out, that is what her Twitter handle is for everyone to go check out. That being said, Alyssa, thank you for coming on to the People's Basics today. We enjoyed having the conversation. Okay, everyone. So that was Alyssa. We encourage you all to come on and have these conversations yourself. We want to hear what's important to you, how you think government needs to be responsible to its people, and what specific changes we can be making. So please go check out the description section, come sign up for a video, or if you're watching this on one of our social media platforms, check our bio and you'll find our Linktree link to be able to find all of our communities, all of our content, and the sign up sheet for you to be able to come on yourself. Furthermore, please help us like this video, share this video so that you help the People's Basics movement growing so that we can continue to be able to get our message out to more people that we need universal basic income, universal basic services, and the universal basic right to liberty, justice, and security. So that being said, my friends, I hope you all are going to have a great day out there on today, Tuesday, April 27th. And as always, I hope you stay classy out there, basic people.